Thank you to everybody who came out today to attend this debate and participate. And thank you to Dr. Vogelstein and Dr. Miller, both of the philosophy department, for participating in the debate. So we're going to proceed in a moment here, and both Dr. Miller and Dr. Vogelstein are going to present opening statements, which will be followed by a back and forth between the two, and they'll have the opportunity to respond to each other. And then following that, we'll open it up to questions from anybody who is in the audience. If you're interested in any more of the information on our organization, the Duquesne Undergraduate Philosophy Society, which is hosting this event, I'll post a link in the chat and you can visit and find out and join our mailing list to hear more about these upcoming events. So we usually begin with the pro side of the argument. So that would be you, right, Dr. Miller?
Yes. All right. Well, thank you, Daniel, for setting this up, and thank you to the Duquesne Undergraduate Philosophy Society for hosting these debates. So I have a prepared statement, a speech, if you like, that will take me about 15 minutes to read, and I'll now turn on my teleprompter. Democracy is the worst form of government, Churchill famously said, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. This will not be my argument for two reasons. First of all, my task is to argue that democracy is good, not that it is the least bad. And second, Churchill was wrong. Democracy is often the worst form of government, period. Consider for a moment the millennia of rule by Egyptian pharaohs and Assyrian kings. Can anyone seriously say that life would have been better for people in those times and places if only they could have voted? Is it even imaginable? Only the priests and some of the nobility of those times and places could read. The rest knew nothing beyond their immediate circumstances, which were a daily grind to survive in the midst of squalor and superstition. Without education, a press, and the other necessary conditions of truly free choice, the franchise would have been an illusion. The stability of those regimes, however grotesque were the sufferings they inflicted on many, is itself an insuperable argument for their wisdom. The thought that democracy is good everywhere for everyone is a sign of anachronistic delusion. I will argue that it is good, but only when certain prerequisites have been fulfilled. This point ought to be clear in the tumultuous wake of George W. Bush's freedom agenda. He forced something resembling democracy on Iraq, destabilizing much of the Middle East, causing hundreds of thousands of deaths, and precipitating a refugee crisis that continues to threaten European democracy itself, ironically enough. Bush's optimism was born of several turn-of-the-century myths, one of which was that democracy is incompatible with war and extremism, whatever that is supposed to be. In the end, Bush used the myth that democracy is peaceable to rationalize a disastrous war, another of that era's historical ironies. But we didn't need recent history to teach us how false this all was. Classical Athens was the first democracy, and it was extremely belligerent. Not satisfied with dominating all the Aegean basin, nor chastened by a decade of war with Sparta, the Athenians voted directly, not via representatives, but in an assembly filled with all the free adult males of the city, to attack the distant city of Syracuse, which had done them no harm. Their reason? They wanted money and glory, to extend their empire beyond their neighborhood, the same charms that have motivated war for all kinds of governments, from monarchies to aristocracies. Democracy is no check on human vice. Indeed, it can exacerbate it. This was the view of the American Federalists, who knew the history of Athens well. Hamilton begins their argument for the Constitution by asserting that, quote, "Of those men who have overturned the liberties of republics, the greatest number have begun their career by paying an obsequious court to the people, commencing demagogues and ending tyrants." The Federalists knew the history of Athens, how it had ostracized its best leaders, executed its best philosophers, and followed its best populists, which is to say, its worst statesmen, into a ruinous war. Their constitution, that is to say, the Federalists' constitution, now ours to some extent, was an ingenious effort to avoid the fate of the Athenians, protecting the people from themselves. This is the version of democracy I wish to defend, not as something that would be good for all societies at all times. Remember the Egyptians and the Assyrians, but only for those capable of practicing it. While I think we Americans have been such a people for over 2 centuries, I fear we are declining and may soon be unable even to appreciate what we have lost. What is that? In a word, freedom. I believe that human beings are free in a way that stones and elephants are not. I made my fuller argument for this conclusion the last time Dr. Vogelstein and I shared the stage, a physical one, I might add, in a very different time, not more than 10 months ago, in a debate on this very question, are we free? I don't expect him to remember it in detail, nor do I expect anyone here today to have been there, so I'd like to summarize it, as it will be the main premise of my argument today. In brief, you are free because you are here today. That is, if you have come to this debate in order to decide what to think about democracy, you presume that you can do so freely. For if you will continue to think about democracy, however you happen to think about it already, you will not need to deliberate about the question. And if by deliberation you mean only that speakers' ideas will enter your mind and push it this way or that by dint of their authority, or the rhetorical power of speech, or the fact that one or the other of us resembles you in some irrelevant ways, then you are not here to deliberate rationally. To do so, I argue, you must survey reasons for and against a question. In this case, is democracy good? And perhaps even call into question the question itself as ill-formed or prejudiced or whatever. That's what I mean by a debate, the mutual pursuit of truth. And if you've come here for one of those, namely a real debate, you too believe we are free. If that's right, we need all kinds of things to actualize this power. We need to be educated, for example. Otherwise, we'll have trouble distinguishing relevant reasons from irrelevant considerations, and we'll be easily duped by demagogues on their way to becoming tyrants. To become educated and to practice the kind of deliberation it supports, we also need freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. Otherwise, we will not be able to enlist each other in the difficult task of discovering and propagating the truth about what is good. For this to be possible on a large scale, additionally, we need freedom of religion, as it is in confessional communities that most people encounter a vision of such truth, and so on for the sorts of rights granted in the American Bill of Rights. A guarantee of these basic rights made American democracy liberal in the sense that the majority would refrain from violating certain rights of the minority, even when they thought it would be good to do so. So I'm not using liberal in the sense of liberal versus conservative, but liberal in the sense of protecting certain basic rights. This was not so in ancient Athens, when a majority could do whatever it wished, regardless of rights. For example, when a majority of the Athenians were enraged about the loss of their navy at Arginusae, they tried in a court of law all the admirals together in violation of all legal protocol. They should have been tried one by one. But there was nothing in the Athenian constitution to forbid them from doing so. There were no guaranteed rights. The will of the majority was thought to be the only criterion of justice. Another limit imposed by the Federalists on the excesses of the mob made our democracy Republican. So first liberal democracy, now Republican democracy. Rather than voting directly on intricate matters of policy, which none but the experts truly understand anyway, we would elect representatives to do so for us. Needless to say, most of our representatives are not experts either, but at least they can devote themselves to the difficult questions of policy, while the rest of us busy ourselves with the business of private life. Needless to say, our representatives can become lazy, corrupt, or overly ambitious. The framers held a dim view of human nature and expected all of that. This is why they divided government at every level. There would be many state governments to check federal excesses, and a strong federal government to keep the states in line. At both levels, state and federal, moreover, government was divided into three branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. With domains of action clearly demarcated, each could act as a check on the others. The framers balanced them so that each had a measure of independence without being separated completely from the ultimate source of legitimacy, the will of the people. With so many procedural limits in the design of the Constitution itself, and so many rights guaranteed by the bill that accompanied its ratification, the framers did as much as human ingenuity could to give us a democracy, to be precise, a liberal, democratic republic that would last. And it has lasted to the present day, though not without serious threats. Most notable was the Civil War, when nearly half the states wished to secede because they rejected the results of a presidential election. But thanks to a wise leader and the sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of young men, our Constitution survived. Americans then learned, even if they must be constantly reminded, that citizens of a democracy must respect the winner of the election as their president, even if his policies and persona are antithetical to their own. The alternative, as Lincoln saw, was the end of this great experiment in self-government. For no country can be democratic without elections, and elections are meaningless if their results can be rejected according to personal or regional judgments. After the Civil War, the next most threatening threats to the survival of our democracy were the twin crises of the Great Depression and the Second World War. During the first of these, many intellectuals thought the liberal democratic ideal had become obsolete. The future, they argued, belonged to fascism and communism, flashy new systems that could remedy economic stagnation with bold initiatives, unfettered by the troublesome procedures of the old republic. But we know how that ended. The regimes that were supposed to be suited to the future fell into the past, while the American Constitution of 1789 became the uncontested model of government most of the world over, until now. It's not entirely clear to me what has gone wrong in the last 2 decades, but for what it's worth, I suspect the internet and globalization have something to do with it. But what do I know? Well, I know that our liberal democratic republic is in crisis, as are many others modeled upon it. And in the midst of this century's crisis, I think it's worth remembering 2 lessons from the worst crises of the last century. First of all, the communists presented themselves as the true Democrats, and not without reason. Looking at the liberal democracies, Marx saw the rights that I spoke about earlier as the liberal rights, the ones that made them liberal, that is freedom of speech, assembly, and religion, for example. He saw these rights as impediments to the will of the majority. In this, he was correct. After all, this was their whole purpose. But whereas liberals wished rights would protect minorities from the zealous mob, communists saw so-called rights as fictions of bourgeois ideology, established to protect the old order of capitalism. So they dispensed with them, and we know how that went. The democratic pretension of the communists was evident from the names they gave their countries. For instance, one of the only ones to survive into this century is still called the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, despite the fact that no regime is less free. The same hypocrisy characterized all the communist countries. Lenin and his Epistocracy argued that the only way to ensure the complete equality for all people was to grant the central government extraordinary powers, for example, of expropriation of the rich, summary justice with the party as judge, and so on, in order to prosecute the revolution to the end. Naturally then, these extraordinary powers became magnets for psychopaths, demagogues who wished to be tyrants, exactly as Hamilton, or for that matter, Plato, had predicted. Here is the first lesson I think we should draw from the 20th century crises of democracy. Although the liberal limits on it may be seen to impede popular rule, they are in fact necessary to preserve it from falling into the hands of tyrants. This is not an abstract philosophical lesson, but one that is urgent for our imminent decisions at all levels, from the federal government to the life of our universities, corporations, and media. One of the biggest threats to democracy in my view, is the relentless pressure by those who fashion themselves Democrats and champions of equality to limit freedoms of speech, assembly, and religion. We ought by now to know the terminus of their enthusiasm. To this first lesson, I would like to add a second. To appreciate it, consider how FDR responded to the Great Depression. Recognizing that the unemployed might revolt if he did not do something to put them to work and manage the economy, Roosevelt saw that the federal government, and the executive branch in particular, would have to arrogate more powers than were granted it by the letter of the Constitution. Effectively, he saw that parts of the Communist Manifesto would need to be adopted by his government. Rather than be overturned by the revolution, in other words, he assimilated it. I'm not criticizing his effort. On the contrary, I think it was wise statesmanship. Like Lincoln, FDR saw that in order to save the Constitution, he had to change it. But by my count, thanks to his New Deal and LBJ's subsequent Great Society, 6 of the 10 demands of Marx and Engels' manifesto are now true of our democracy. As FDR implemented these dramatic changes accordingly, he met opposition from the Supreme Court of the time, who recognized that he was altering, if not undermining, the Constitution. Like the intellectuals of that era, FDR too became impatient with the Republican limits on democracy. He sought to pack the court in order to overcome these limits. Yet even his own party would not grant him such extraordinary powers. In our times, by contrast, both parties are casting aside these limits. Whether it's executive orders, judicial appointments, or legislative procedures, each party outdoes the other in its disregard for norms and traditions. This is the season of historical analogies, and my choice is the late Roman Republic, an old constitution, imperfectly democratic, destabilized by unemployment and massive wealth inequality. The Gracchi brothers were right to try to distribute land and power more broadly than the senators were willing to allow. And maybe they did have to start violating norms and traditions when the senators blocked their every effort to do so. But after that, who can say whether it was the Optimates or the Populares who were responsible for the decline of freedom in Rome? It lasted a century, and it was just one power grab after another. If this folie à deux here in the American case continues, our liberal democratic republic cannot survive. Americans will still be here, God willing, but we will live under a different sort of regime. If I'm right that the Roman case is most analogous, we should expect it to be a monarchy in all but name. In any case, whether we want that is up to us. We seem to be living through the beginning of the end. To arrest that decline, the parties must restore their respect for the liberal and Republican limits on our democracy. But because they respond to our votes, they will only do that once voters punish them for behaving this way, that is, when they don't respect those limits. We, the people, must first understand our Constitution and its principles. I fear that this understanding has disappeared from our culture, and I'm not sure how, in the present climate, it could be revived. This is not a partisan issue, I believe, but a general failure of self-understanding that knows no party. I suspect the problem goes deeper than atrophied civics classes. In my estimation, it is fundamentally a spiritual crisis, a confusion about what it means to be self-governing as individuals as well as a nation. The beginning of the revival, however quixotic, must be to understand ourselves as free, capable of genuine deliberation and debate. So here we are. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. Dr. Vogelstein, would you like to proceed with your introduction?
Yes, thank you. So I'm going to start with the exact same quote that Dr. Miller did. Great minds think alike, what can I say? All right, so democracy was called by Winston Churchill the worst form of government except for all the others. It's not hard to see why he thought that. Democratic countries, despite some significant flaws, have a far better track record of protecting human rights and civil liberties and provide a far higher quality of life for its citizens than do the standard alternatives. And indeed, the visible alternatives are quite awful. They are, by and large, autocratic or otherwise totalitarian regimes. But in order to know whether democracy is the best we can do, we need to compare it not only to the political systems that exist or have existed, but rather to all possible alternatives, at least all possible realistic alternatives. In other words, we need to use our imaginations a bit more. So I'll suggest that if we do that, then a good case can be made that there are alternatives to democracy that might correct for its flaws while maintaining its primary benefits. So one caveat, I will focus today on representative democracy, in which the people elect representatives to enact policy, as opposed to direct democracy, where the people vote on policy directly, just because direct democracy on any sort of large-scale level is widely understood to be practically unfeasible. All right, so democracy has some problems. The first concerns a fact that is insufficiently appreciated, I believe, probably because many of us don't want to accept that it's true, that the electorate, those who vote for our representatives, are systematically ignorant, misinformed, biased, and irrational. A mountain of empirical evidence in the fields of political science and psychology demonstrates quite conclusively that the majority of us do not form political beliefs in an informed or rational way. And indeed, voting competently is hard. It takes a lot of knowledge and understanding about a wide variety of subjects to vote well. In order to reliably vote for people who will be good leaders and enact good policy, one needs rational and informed political beliefs. And in order to have rational and informed political beliefs, one needs to know a lot. One needs to be familiar, for instance, with history, international relations, and most importantly, perhaps the social sciences such as economics and sociology, in order to evaluate the effects of public policy. And one arguably needs to know some basic moral and political philosophy in order to evaluate the aims of public policy. But most voters do not know or are misinformed about the most basic tenets of these fields and the various evidence and arguments they bring to bear on the choices that voters are called upon to make. Furthermore, large proportions of voters do not even know what policies individual candidates want to enact. One would think that the advent of political parties would simplify the way in which voters acquire information about candidates. One only needs to learn the views of the party and then attribute them to the associated candidate. But as it turns out, voters are ignorant about what the parties stand for as well. Many do not even know what general policy differences exist between generic liberal and conservative candidates. The standard explanation for widespread voter ignorance is twofold. First, even if one has a good faith desire to have true political beliefs, it's irrational to try to acquire the relevant information because doing so doesn't have any significant payoff. The likelihood that one's vote will swing a large election is essentially zero, so it doesn't benefit a person to be fully informed. And at the same time, becoming fully informed has a significant cost in terms of the large amounts of time and effort required to do so. Second, most people don't have a good faith desire to have true political beliefs because the psychological costs of doing so are quite high, again, without any real benefit. People want to avoid uncertainty, admitting ignorance, changing their cherished beliefs, opposing the views of the groups with which they identify, etc. And none of these things that I just mentioned feels good, yet they're the predictable results of thinking rationally about politics. One makes oneself vulnerable by doing so. It's just more comfortable to remain uninformed and irrational. Psychologists call this motivated reasoning. In other words, believing what we're motivated to believe rather than what's actually true. And motivated reasoning affects us all. Especially relevant to political beliefs is a form of motivated reasoning called groupthink. accepting a belief not based on evidence and reason, but simply because it makes us fit in with a social group to which we belong, such as our family, our friends, our community, our religious group, etc. Politics is particularly prone to groupthink. After all, politics is tribal. We often belong to political groups determined by the sorts of subcultures to which we belong that have ideologies: left, right, liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican, socialist, libertarian, and so on. So voting is often more like rooting for one's team than it is providing a dispassionate assessment of a candidate's policy proposals. In fact, the democratic process itself fosters tribalistic biases, as we retreat into our respective camps and filter evidence through our tribe's ideological lens, seeking out evidence and arguments that confirm our cherished beliefs and ignoring or discounting evidence and arguments that oppose it, the so-called confirmation bias. And ironically, the more into politics one is, and thus the more likely to vote one is, the more tribally biased one is likely to be. And lest one think that the representatives themselves will provide some significant buffer against the incompetence of the electorate, note that not only will the representatives to a significant degree mirror the views of those who elect them, but the quality of the candidates themselves will be determined by incompetent primary voters. And we will be left choosing from a set of candidates whose views reflect the ignorance, misinformation, and biases of those who have selected them. The upshot is that we're in dire straits if the goal of democracy is to arrive at sound public policies with competent leaders to implement them. We just can't get there from here. We just can't get from here to there if the path we take is riddled with ignorance, misinformation, irrationality, and bias. The electorate is simply not competent to do the job for which democracy has hired them. So where does that leave us? Well, one option, recently defended by Jason Brennan, a philosopher at Georgetown University, is what is called epistocracy, government by the knowledgeable. The basic idea behind epistocracy is that we all have the right to be ruled by a competent electorate. Voting, and thus the electorate, has the potential to impose enormous harm on us all. And given the fact that an equal and universal electorate, that is, one that includes everyone and in which everyone's vote counts the same, will vote with a high degree of incompetence, right? So given that, it's justified to either restrict that electorate by ruling out those who are below a basic threshold of political competence, or by giving more votes to those who demonstrate greater degrees of political competence. So in that sense, voting should be viewed as a privilege or a conditional right, rather than an unconditional right. Just as we would not permit an incompetent driver to get behind the wheel of a car due to the enormous harm such a driver could cause, we should not permit voters who are full of misinformation and irrational biases to impose serious harms on everyone. We have a basic test in order to license competent drivers. In an epistocracy, the same principle would apply to voters. By requiring that voters demonstrate some level of basic political competence, such as knowing the policy platforms of the political parties, basic social science, or the primary workings of government. And if they're unable to do so, they would either not be able to vote or not have their vote count as much as those who demonstrate that competence. Now, I won't have time to get into the details of exactly how we might license voters, what the content of any such test might be, or how it should be implemented. But it's worth noting that the net result of such a policy need not be that voting power is concentrated in a handful of intellectual elites. Perhaps, for example, the minimum threshold of competence would include a large percentage of the current electorate, maybe even a majority of it. Moreover, we could institute various programs in order to make people more politically competent, which would itself improve the quality of the electorate and thus those who they elect. Perhaps then even a very large majority of the current electorate would qualify. And we could implement any test of political competence using a wide variety of different methods in order to cure everyone who might be politically competent while excluding no one. We can use our imagination here. Epistocracy, properly conceived, is about inclusively improving the quality of the electorate, not just about excluding those who would impose their votes incompetently. But one might object, doesn't this violate the rights of the people to govern themselves by excluding some people who would nevertheless be subject to laws about which they have no say? Shouldn't everyone therefore be given equal political rights? In response, I would suggest that political rights are not like other rights. Political rights are not civil rights, such as the right to freedom of speech and freedom of religion, or even the right to a free press and freedom of assembly. That is because having political rights, including having the right to vote in a democracy, is to have power over others, the power to control people's lives. The law, at its core, is a form of coercion via the threat of violence. Having the ability to create law, even indirectly through electing representatives, is therefore a momentous type of power. And so we have to ask whether someone should be given such power. In particular, we need to ask whether everyone is competent and qualified to wield it. And if we conclude that some people are not competent to wield that power responsibly, it is perfectly reasonable to grant them unequal access to that power or to strip them of it altogether. But suppose that you are opposed to epistocracy, and indeed there are some worries about how such a system would be implemented and whether it would create it would concentrate political power among certain groups who have advantages in acquiring political competence in the first place, although I think such worries are probably ultimately unfounded. Still, epistocracy is not the only plausible alternative to democracy. Instead, we might have a system of representative government via lottery, or what is known as sortition. Such a proposal has a history in ancient Athens, medieval and Renaissance Italy, and in a limited form in present-day Europe and Canada, and it's recently been defended in detail by the Rutgers University philosopher Alex Guerrero. His proposal, that he calls lotocracy, would involve replacing elected legislatures with many single-issue legislative bodies composed of several hundred randomly selected adults, each responsible for a particular area of public policy, such as healthcare, immigration, trade, education, energy, taxes, criminal justice, etc. Each body would spend 1 year researching the subject with the input of relevant experts and stakeholders, discussing and debating policy, drafting relevant legislation, and then voting on it. This would be a full-time job, and they would be paid a good salary for it. A lotocracy avoids the elitism objection to epistocracy, since it would draw its members evenly from the population. It also significantly increases the competence of those who enact laws, since the legislature would spend considerable amounts of time learning from all relevant parties and experts, and from each other when they discuss the issue. And it would mitigate against groupthink, as one would become part of a new and diverse group with the aim only of collectively working to enact good policy. Finally, lotocracy avoids an additional problem with modern democracy: the fact that elected representatives are easily corrupted by special interests who pay for their electoral campaigns and who thus gain special access and favors that find their way into law, benefiting those interests at the expense of the rest of us. Indeed, it's reasonable to suspect that this result is the inevitable consequence of any modern representative democracy, given how difficult it is to hold elected representatives accountable for that sort of corruption. In particular, it's very difficult for most people to figure out and keep track of exactly how various special interests are being catered to, for reasons that I've already gone over, especially given that the very special interests in question will spend massive amounts of money to make sure that we are not aware of it, or are misinformed about it, or are more concerned about other things. In a lotocratic system, on the other hand, this sort of corruption is far more difficult to accomplish, since the representatives do not depend upon the financial resources of special interests to get themselves or keep themselves in power. So at the very least, I would suggest that democracy has no obvious advantages over lautocracy or epistocracy. And in fact, quite the opposite. So in the end, is democracy good? Perhaps yes, in the grand scheme of things. Are there alternative systems of governance that may very well be better? It would seem so as well. Democracy isn't particularly good then when compared to some reasonable alternatives. Thanks.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you.
So how should we do the next section? I recommend we keep it brief. And I don't know, Eric, I'll respond maybe to your speech just with a couple of points, and then you can do the same to mine. Then we'll open up to questions from the audience.
Sure.
Okay. So I'll just take your final line. I had some particular objections about the distribution of power and so on, but I think it's probably best to just go towards the end where you say that democracy has no obvious advantages over lautocracy and epistocracy. This is coming, of course, from the perspective of my speech, so it presumes what I argued, but if self-government itself is good, that's a clear advantage. So that, the other point where I thought this concerned your argument was you said, well, when we have political rights, those are different from civil rights. And I agree. I'm thinking of Benjamin Constant distinguishing between positive rights and negative rights. We have negative rights to protect ourselves from the infringement of the government, but we have positive rights to make decisions in the public sphere. And the way you characterize those positive rights or political rights was control over other people. And of course, that's a consequence. If I vote on a certain tax policy, then that's going to affect, people of certain brackets and so on. But I'm one of those people. So that if self-government is a good or perhaps even a right, then that gives it an obvious value that I don't see matched by lautocracy and epistocracy.
So, yeah, I guess I'd want to hear a little more about in what sense one is governing oneself. So, one thing I could say here is the simple fact that any one vote has literally no impact except in small elections. So the argument is often made that democracy enables the electorate to consent to various laws, right? But it's an extremely bizarre type of consent because the law is going to be imposed upon me regardless of whether I consent to it or not, right? So the fact that there's really no causation, direct causation, in the sense that my one vote cannot possibly make a difference to anything that happens to me through law on a large scale, makes me question whether this is real freedom, whether this is a type of freedom that's valuable. Certainly people want to vote, right? It's a freedom in the sense that if you want to vote, then being allowed to vote makes you more free. It lets you do what you want. But beyond that, I'm not sure I see any more robust sort of freedom that we should sacrifice the other benefits of epistocracy or lautocracy for.
I think you should be careful, though, because if you adopt that response, that undercuts your argument for epistocracy and lautocracy. Because as I understood your argument, it was, look, the electorate is basically incompetent, and as a result, we shouldn't trust them with decisions. And so let's find these ways to still remain kind of democratic, but without trusting the electorate. But if your point is, well, any individual's vote doesn't really matter, it's approaching zero in its effect on affairs, then, well, go ahead. In other words, the argument cuts the other way. Just give them the vote because it doesn't matter.
So what does matter is how groups vote, right? So
yes,
individually we don't make a difference. Collectively we do. So the way I view it is that a political system is a form of social technology, and we want the best technology we can muster, and we can evaluate that technology along one primary dimension, which is just how much good it does. And I think that's, unless there are some serious rights violations going on that outweigh that, that's the primary way we should evaluate this sort of social technology. And so my intent was to identify some harms of the way of the, the current technology, and propose some more modern social technology, political technology.
And I think I'm glad you used that word, social technology, because I think that really characterizes the difference between our approaches. That you're seeing what's the best means to our goals, whatever our goals are, prosperity, justice, whatever, and then democracy, especially epistocracy, autocracy, is the best technology that will get us there. Whereas my approach is democracy is integral to living the best life, where living freely is part of the best life. And so that even if in the end, democracy gave us bad outcomes, according to my argument, it would still be the best government.
Right. So I would invite anyone who is considering their own disenfranchisement to really ask themselves, what type of freedom have you really lost here? You haven't actually lost any freedom to change the way the law affects you. How important is, you may have lost some sort of symbolic exercise, but there's plenty of better ways to symbolically express your political beliefs than voting, which has no effect, and you have that little I voted sticker. I guess that's something you can post it all over Instagram, but writing something, making art, talking to people, protesting. There's a million better ways to express your views than voting. So that symbolic argument, which has been offered by some people, I don't think is particularly persuasive either. But I would just say, look, if you're concerned about your lack of freedom now that your vote has been taken away, or now that someone else has 8 votes and you only have 1, I would say think about what exactly that loss truly is. And if I'm right, it's more like the loss of a driver who's hit 12 parked cars on their driving test. You've lost the freedom to drive, but you should probably recognize it, maybe take some lessons and then come back and take the test later. I mean, it's so that flip side of imposing harms on other people, I think, has to be weighed against any, even if I accept that there's this loss of freedom, I think that has to be weighed against it.
This will be the last thing I'll say, because I'm eager to hear from the audience, or to have your critiques of my position if you wish. But I want to say I basically agree with you. That was the point I was making about the Egyptians and the Assyrians, that they would be the equivalent, their people would be the equivalent of somebody who would hit 12 parked cars if you were to put them behind the wheel of a car. It's actually a really good analogy. They've never seen the thing before. Just throw them into it. They're going to smash everything that they see. And my argument was, to some extent, a historical argument, saying, all right, this nation, because of its particular history, got to a point in the 18th century where it was able to do this. And by some miracles, it managed to keep doing it for a long time. And in my estimation now, it's not clear to me that it's able to do it anymore, or that if it is, that it's going to last very long. So I think to that extent, we both agree that, at some point the franchise is going to it needs to be taken away. But it's a question of whether we're there yet.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, the type of governments that each of our views imply might be very similar. I mean, if I want to make people as smart politically as possible, and at the end of the day, that might be basically equivalent to a democratic system.
Yeah, I mean, the epistocracy, you argued against representation, and there were some good sort of Meno paradox type arguments against representation. But the American founders had this idea that the electors, it wasn't every citizen. You could be a citizen, but if you didn't have a certain amount of land, then you couldn't even cast a vote. So their criterion would, of course, differ from yours. But the idea of limiting the franchise, we think now in retrospect about race and gender, but for them, it was also about land possession.
Well, I should note we limit the franchise now. And I'm not talking about voter suppression. You have to be 18 years old to vote.
Right. You can't be a felon.
Yep. In many states. And look, a 16-year-old can petition a judge to make a refusal of life-saving medical treatment. Mm-hmm. Actually, there have been cases where 14-year-olds do that. There's a really good case to be made. Well, let me put it this way. the limitation of voting by age is not necessarily a bad idea. It might be, a lot of people think it should be 16. But the general idea that we should either have a strict cutoff or lower the power of voting as you get younger is exactly the same rationale that I use to defend epistocracy. The only reason why we wouldn't allow a 12-year-old to vote is because we don't think they're competent to make political decisions. It's perfectly far better political deciders than are a host of 45-year-olds. So if we're limiting votes based on age, I think that it's only a matter of practicality, not a matter of principle, then, that prevents us from limiting votes based on general political competence. Because age is just supposed to be a proxy for political competence.
Yeah, and I don't think those set aside practical questions like, all right, there's this objection that however it is that you make those epistocratic distinctions, that's a practical problem that you weren't going to get into. But it seemed to me all the power now is going to be in the administration of that test. Who gets to pick the questions that count, that assess who's competent, and who administers that test, who grades it. It seems like the school teachers of epistocratic competency are going to become the new tyrants.
Yeah, so I'm drawing a lot from Jason Brennan's 2016 book Against Democracy, in which he defends epistocracy, and his response to that, which I'll adopt here, is that while democracies, or the will of the people, are not particularly competent at doing some things, they are competent at doing other things. And one thing they might be competent at is choosing the criteria by which we identify who is politically competent. Right? We could be very good at the identifying the principles, even if we're really bad at applying those principles. So we might have the right, we might be able to democratically devise the right sort of test, even if 75% of us won't pass that test. That's at least a possibility.
I'm skeptical. Anyway, I kept saying I wouldn't take up time, and I was eager to hear from either you or the audience, so I'll stop.
I assumed someone was going to call me an elitist. I was ready for that one. Or call my position elitist, I should say.
I recognize a lot of elitists in the audience, so you have no worries.
They're all like, yup, epistocracy.
Yeah, the one thing oh, sorry, was somebody else going to speak?
No, please, go ahead.
The one thing I'm not entirely clear of is if there's a difference between epistocracy and technocracy, and if so, why epistocracy and not technocracy?
So I'm actually not quite sure what a technocracy is. Government by the technologically advanced?
No, simply by the qualified.
The qualified to do what?
Well, it depends on the area, so to speak. So for example, if we're consider, let's say a public discourse, right, a Habermas style, the only ones who would get access to, say, a discourse on artificial intelligence are people whose specialization is related to artificial intelligence, not just computer scientists, mind you, but, for example, psychologists, philosophers, and so on. Now, if the discourse is about medicine, you would get doctors in that discourse as qualified to speak about that. You might also get data scientists and people related to, healthcare ethics and all that.
Yeah, so epistocracy is a form of technocracy. Now, I should note, Habermas has a quite optimistic view of the way in which talking with each other
that's why that's kind of
enlightens us.
Habermas. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And this is again something that Dr. Brennan talks about in his book, the extent to which having these sorts of discussions makes us more politically incompetent by kind of reaffirming our biases and polarizing us into our respective camps. I'm a big fan of empirical research as a guide in these matters, and there's a lot, and it's kind of disturbing, honestly, about how, you know, how these sorts of political discussions, you know, just reify biases and make us worse thinkers about these questions. So that would be my disagreement with Habermas. But as far as how to classify these things, yeah, epistocracy is a form of technocracy in that sense.
Thank you. If somebody could please send me that research, because that sounds really interesting, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Simon, were you going to ask a question?
If I may, I have Patrick's text in front of me. So I'm sorry, I'm Simon. I'm from CMU, sneaking in. I'm really surprised because both of you agree that democracy has gone desperately wrong right now. And what you're doing, I would say, is having sort of a meta-political discussion, right? Like, let's fix politics. Many people right now think democracy is going great. There are huge rallies. People are thrilled right now. So what would you say? I mean, it sounds like what you guys are doing is actually not making a meta-political point, but a directly political point. Whereas, you know, the very idea that something has gone wrong may in fact be, for many people, that it's gone right. So is it possible to make a meta-political point while it appears in some ways taking a political position?
So I'm not sure whether my argument was political or meta-political. I'll allow you to come back and tell me which of the two and why. But I certainly was trying to make a point about the current state of American democracy. So on that level, it was a non-meta but first level political argument. And I was arguing that democracy is going badly because it's ceasing to become liberal and it's ceasing to become Republican. It's becoming more purely democratic, which the fate of pure democracies, whether we're talking about Athens or Moscow in 1917, don't tend to be good. I think the framers were right that we need human rights and we need divided government to protect the people against themselves.
So let me try this. So I think we can evaluate how good a political system is irrespective of any on the ground empirical results about its performance, because we have less other sorts of empirical grounds for evaluating the competence of that type of technology, right? We can make reasonable inferences about the outputs of this sort of political technology without evaluating those outputs per se. So in that sense, it's kind of both meta and first level. So as long as, I think my argument goes through, you know, just by looking at what we know about the electorate and how good they are making decisions. And in any case, evaluating the consequences is going to be evaluating a counterfactual that's very difficult to do. Right? So we have to ask what would have happened if we had done things another way. So things might be going great, you know, compared to yesterday, but they would have been going a hell of a lot better, you know, if we'd had an epistocracy. So that's another response that I'd make. But I mean, your point is well taken. I mean, you could just say, well, look, how much better do you want us to be doing here? We're doing great. Now, I don't know who would say we're doing great right now. You know, if we're talking about political engagement, I mean, that's a necessary but far from sufficient condition for doing great. I mean, in fact, it could make us do worse given the sorts of problems with the electorate that I mentioned. We might be more politically engaged, but we might be more polarized. We might be more biased. We might be more huddled in our groups, in our echo chambers, etc. So that's another concern that I have. But thanks. Good question. Yeah.
Speaking about political engagement, I just saw a headline a few hours ago that I thought was amusing. And we've seen so many photos in the press about lines in front of polling places, and this article, which I didn't have time to read because I was preparing the speech. This article is saying sometimes those lines are presented as something's gone terribly wrong with democracy, there's voter suppression, there's corruption, etc. Sometimes those very same pictures are used as democracy is going so well, so many people are showing up to the polls. And it really just depends on ideological bias, how you see the picture.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly think that we don't have a lot to lose by choosing some of the, by trying out one of these other systems on at least a small scale basis. I mean, we could do the whole laboratory of democracy thing, or the laboratory of lautocracy or epistocracy thing, and, try it out on a local level, a regional level, even a state level, a small state. Let's try Rhode Island, and see how it goes. I mean, there's a way to do this gradually. There's a way to begin small, not just population-wise, but with the policy, and I don't, have the test be super inclusive and give people who pass it 1.5 votes and the people who don't, 1 vote or something like. I mean, my point is that there's a scale of how strong or weak we can make these alternatives in the beginning. But I don't think we have much to lose by trying it.
Eric, what I say is not to refute what you're just saying, but just once again to draw the distinction between our two positions, in case it's not already clear. It's that you see it as a technological question, and I see it as a question about constituents of the good life. So here's an analogy. What if I said, all right, we have nothing to lose by taking away your freedom, Eric. According to this system, the computer will have these outcomes for you. According to this other system, it'll have these, you'll have to date this person, but this other computer will choose this other person. And according to this model, you're going to be happier than this other. Well, something's lost if you think that you have freedom and that's integral to living a good life. That's what I'm saying about political life once a society gets to a certain level of sophistication.
No, that's right. Yeah, I was operating from within that,
yeah.
that perspective of evaluating the, basically the net utility of these systems.
Yeah.
Although, yeah, so, I mean, it is an interesting question, what the right is that is being, I mean, I think you could, I'm not sure actually if it's, so I was understanding your view along the lines of rights as opposed to some sort of semi-Aristotelian view that it sounded like you were putting forward in terms of.
Well, it's Platonic, but maybe in your vocabulary, Aristotelian would capture what it is. I mean, it's at the highest level of generality, it's that there's a good life and freedom is a part of it. And without certain preconditions, we're not able to live that. And that was my account of the Egyptians and the Assyrians. But once we get to a certain level, we're capable of it. And to be deprived of the opportunity would be like having a computer pick your girlfriend.
Except that voting has no consequence. One, by which I mean one individual vote doesn't change my life at all. That's the difference, and that's where I would press. That's where I would say, well, yeah, I mean, look, you can. The question isn't is taking away someone's fundamental freedom bad, that in a way that might even outweigh massive increases in net utility, net well-being, but is voting that type of freedom, right? And that's where I think we would disagree.
Yeah. And then I'm still confused about how you reply when I say that it seems to me you've undercut your entire argument by saying voting doesn't really matter. And so I thought the whole argument was, it does matter. People are so incompetent. We got to take it away from them because they're doing so much harm.
It matters who votes, but it doesn't matter whether I vote. It matters collectively. It doesn't matter any one individual, just tweak. So it's a matter of what the counterfactual is. Are we tweaking my vote or one individual person's vote and comparing that to what would have happened otherwise, or are we tweaking a large group of people's vote?
Seems to me you have a Sorites paradox there. That
would it be?
Well, at some point it makes a difference, right? I mean,
sorry, Simon, you should reply. You asked a question and we ended up talking for 10 minutes.
No, this is wonderful. But I want to return to this question of whether you guys, in apparently discussing metapolitics, are really talking about politics, right? Eric, you said, okay, the test is going to be inclusive. It's a very political word, right? What does it mean to be inclusive? I think this is what Patrick means when he says it's the paradox of the Meno, right? How are you going to get the political validity of whatever test you subscribe to, right? Do we vote on that? I'm just wondering if you've really escaped the underlying problem. And I think maybe this comes back to the idea that there's a sense in which we have, part of our flourishing is to make political decisions. The test itself is a political decision. What's the test for the test? And what's the test for the test for the test? You guys have referred to human rights. Is there a human right to open borders? Is there a human right to gay marriage? All these things, I think, for many of us, yes, but these are also political questions. So I'm wondering, and maybe you guys, and I think Patrick says yes, right? Maybe you guys accept that there is no such thing as a metapolitics, that it's all political, in which case you guys are making a political argument just as any politician is, except what you're doing is not violating the procedure right now. You're going to violate very deep procedures that are, currently constitutional.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to put a fine line between political and the metapolitical, but so I mean, I mentioned one way of responding to you about who gets to make the test. I don't know if you briefly stepped out for that, but my response was, and this might not be a good response, but my response was that the people, the electorate, are not necessarily bad at making all sorts of decisions. And one thing they might be quite good at is selecting the criteria by which political competence can be judged, even if they're really bad at applying that criteria or meeting that criteria. So for example, this is an example, Jason, I'm relying a lot on Jason Brennan's book because he is the #1 defender of epistocracy in philosophy today. But he makes an analogy about if you asked anyone what qualities they would look for in a spouse, you could ask an 8-year-old child what qualities are good qualities in a spouse. But many people are still very, very bad at applying those qualities when it comes time to choose a spouse. So, right, people get into bad relationships as a matter of course, right? I mean, it's so we're good at writing down the criteria, figuring out what the general principles are, but when it comes time to applying those criteria, right, it's a lot harder to do that. And I think for that reason, we could vote on the test without contradicting the rest of the argument that I was making.
Let me just question, if I may, that analogy. I think it applies one-to-one, and I think I'm on Simon's side here, that we take the marriage question. I think when people formulate general criteria, those are actually bad criteria. It's not just that they're bad at applying them, it's that those are usually meaningless, or in actual fact, those are not what they want, not what anybody would want. So we have a fantasy of what a good marriage would be, and it's actually not a good marriage when we think it through. And yeah, we're really bad in particular instances as well, but not as bad as we are in the general. Similarly, in politics, and I took this to be Simon's point, that even coming up with a test or a procedure for picking the right questions to ask in the epistocratic, why should we expect that people are good at that? And what would the criteria for evaluating that be? That's the infinite regress that I took Simon to be asking about.
Well, you don't need, there's no regress if you just end at people are competent to make those sorts of decisions. So for example, I mean,
Taking the question though.
Yeah.
What's competent?
I mean, Eric, if I may, I would guess right now, I mean, given, I don't know how this vote's going to go. I think many people, given the choice, would say, you know what? Rich people, they've proven their worth. So we're going to weight these votes by wealth. And we take a vote. It could go that way. So would you be willing to accept that? Would you say, you know what? People are pretty wise. And I think even though I disagree, the majority got it right. So we're going to weight these votes by your current bank account. Would you be willing to accept that?
Well, that would be a proof that that my thesis was wrong, right? So in that case, no, I would not accept that. And then we'd have to figure out, but unless that happens, like I'm willing to bet that that's not going to, I'm willing to bet that people are going to say things like, well, you need to know, in order to pass this, you need to have some basic knowledge of economics. I'm talking at that level of generality. I'm not talking, and we can then go to the economics professors and say, all right, what are like the widely accepted, proven basic tenets of your field that affect public policy? And then that's just off the top of my head the type of thing I'm imagining here. But
those
yeah,
be
look, your point is well taken.
Would those be the Nobel Prize winners who invented black shoals and crashed the economy?
Right. Or is it a hacker
So
group?
you don't
Who are you gonna
accept
trust?
any controversies. You just accept things that are widely. So microeconomics, from what I understand, is far more solidified in its findings than macroeconomics. And we would, just very, very basic things. I don't know, I'm not an economist, but, just as an example, the idea that free trade boosts a country's GDP. Everyone accepts this regardless of what part of the political spectrum you're on. This is like, from what I understand, akin to accepting, climate change from a climate scientist, so something like that. And if I'm wrong about the details, we can, that's fine. I'll change my example, but yeah, look, I take your point. I'm doing my best to fend off this objection, but I might not be doing the best job. But let's get Alejandra's comment.
Sorry, that's actually to kind of both defend you and go against you. The thing is, you can't just have a test. It's been proven that there's a huge issue with what we call enumerating values, right? So say you make up a test, right, to figure out who's qualified. Any little thing you could possibly leave out is already a discrete risk, which will negatively impact the utility function of the whole society. So what people are trying to figure out is what's called indirect normativity. That is to say, how do you get a set of meta values, a set of meta considerations, such that instead of having to list everything and test people actively with that risk of let's say making a catastrophic error by excluding something or including the wrong thing, you find this, again, meta-normative set of considerations. And, I take this from the study of artificial superintelligence, which means we're thinking about the machine, but you can't probably do that without the machines. It's just, how do you formalize a system which does not require you to enumerate values, but instead get, say, one huge meta value or a set of meta values, which would then inform how people are qualified or not, right? Because the problem is that selection does not select for ethics. That is to say, whether it's a test or whether it's meta values, you're not actually selecting the best possible people. You're not guaranteed a non-negative impact on the public utility function or even on private utility functions. And that is also true for democracy. If you select for everyone, you're still not guaranteed any, let's say, non-negative net impact. That's kind of the problem I see. The whole test issue is wrong, but also figuring out an indirect normativity is kind of a mess.
So I want to see if you're not saying that there's some sort of something analogous or identical to like an infinite utility problem, where if you could mess up and have a catastrophic result, and that's, for all we know, that has a non-negligible probability, and therefore the utility function is going to be identical for any system. That's not what you're saying, right?
No, not exactly.
Okay.
The problem is that, say, we're in the current state of democracy, right? This accrues state risk. That is to say, there's always a catastrophic risk, and the longer you stay in the same state, the higher the probability of that risk happening. A transition to anything else has a discrete risk, right? Because it's the risk of the transition itself. Now, when we think about making tests and figuring out meta values, the risk is precisely in how we specify those values or how we formalize that indirect normativity. And it's been proven that making those tests, which are analogous to specifying values, is much more prone to a catastrophic discrete risk than is staying in the previous state. At least that's what Duquesne figured out when studying superintelligence.
How would that apply to Just very basic political knowledge, like knowing what policies a particular party endorses.
Well, you were talking about more knowledge of economics or a set of knowledges, right? And the problem is, how do you specify those knowledges? And how do you ensure that knowing these things is an appropriate selection mechanism? It's kind of the inherent problem of selection mechanisms.
Yeah, okay. I mean, that's a fair point. I would have to, I think a lot of the details matter here. So you'd have to draw a line between the knowledge and the vote, right? How does this piece of information bear on a particular policy or platform or something along those lines? Yeah.
Right, and I actually largely agree with you. The only big difference is that I say you can't really enumerate values through a test. You have to find a meta-normativity to figure those things out. But practically speaking, we're mostly in agreement.
There are some chats that I just noticed. Oh, okay. Nothing substantive. Does anyone else have any other questions, comments, disagreements? I mean, one thing that that I think is worth mentioning is that one thing Brennan relies on a lot in his book is, and maybe more, he relies on it more than I think he notes, is the empirical finding, apparently, I'm not an expert on this literature, but the finding that people vote based on what they perceive to be the national interest and not on their own self-interest for the most part. And the reason this is important is because if political power is concentrated among certain groups of people who are antecedently better at acquiring competence, then and those groups have different interests than the people who have been excluded, then you get the elitism objection that I referenced before. And so if people are voting for their own self-interests, and now we have, right, this, the top, say, 20% of people who are knowledgeable, and those people come from a certain group that has different interests than the bottom, some other groups, that could lead to some sort of tyrannical governance, or at least some form of, something akin to corruption. But here's the thing: this empirical finding makes perfect sense given how little power we have in voting, right? It doesn't make any sense for me to vote for my own self-interests if my vote won't make a difference. If I'm being selfish, it doesn't make any sense for me to vote selfishly, unless I corral like a million other people to vote selfishly. But just me voting selfishly doesn't make rational sense, which is the standard explanation for why this finding exists, that most people vote out of a sense of morality, a sense of what's best for the nation, not what's best for them. And it makes a lot of sense. I mean, look at how many Democrats want to, rich Democrats want to increase their own taxes, right? So that's just an example of that.
I have, if unless somebody wants to follow that line, I have a different line, and it's not a critical question so much. It's just an invitation for all of us to think about the question of representation, because Eric, in your talk, you had a critique of representation, which is that, and again, it's sort of kind of a Meno problem, that if people who are incompetent are picking representatives, then they're going to pick incompetent representatives. And the framers of the American Constitution, who really thought this was the ingenuity of modern politics, they looked at antiquity and they said there really wasn't much representation in antiquity. This is the contribution of modern politics. We have representatives. And they thought this was going to solve political problems because they agreed that most of the electorate was incompetent, but that whereas your average Pennsylvania farmer is bad at deciding how the United States should negotiate with Spain, the average Pennsylvania farmer is good at picking a representative. People are better judges of character than they are of policy. And they could grant, all right, even though incompetent, stupid electorate is going to pick stupid, incompetent representatives. The representatives are going to be less stupid and less incompetent than the people who pick them. That's all they need for the argument, is that, and in fact, they thought you get layers of representation so that eventually your politicians get, they're getting better and better. Eventually you get up to the president, who's going to be the best of all. Again, because the president wasn't picked directly, but through the Electoral College, which had a real decision role to make, not just we're going to do whatever it said. So anyway, I'm just inviting either Eric or anybody in the group, because I just don't know what's the answer to that question. Are we better at picking representatives than we are at picking policies? And if so, then representation does have an argument on its behalf.
I mean, I think we might be better, we probably are better at picking representatives in policy, but we still might not be as good as we could be at picking representatives collectively.
Mm-hmm. It's tied into this question of whether character matters, say, in a president. I mean, common argument of Trump supporters is he's a terrible character, but he's doing a very good job at enacting the policies that I want to have enacted. And it seems to me a terrible error, because most of what a president does is decisions that nobody can predict. I mean, it just seems to me that if they make 10 decisions in one day, 9.5 of them are going to be spontaneous ones that nobody even knew was going to be happening a week before that. And, if you pick at least a good character, then you're more likely to get 9 good decisions than 9 bad decisions.
Yeah, it's also worth noting that any, the argument for democracy is undercut if it doesn't matter who we elect. They're going to be this magical buffer, especially if you have like 3 layers of representatives, electing representatives. If the idea is supposed to be, well, they'll be a bulwark against any sort of incompetence of the electorate, then what are we doing here, right? We're just throwing our vote in a box, and then we get the same level of competence no matter who we vote for, right? If that's the argument, it seems to be kind of diminish the value of democracy a lot.
Oh, I agree. I mean, I wasn't presenting up here in case. I was saying, here's the framers' notion that character matters, and then here's this recent notion that character doesn't matter. And I think you're right that if you put those two together, which is basically what we have, we've got this system of representation, but then we've got this culture of character doesn't matter, not among everybody, obviously, but among some. Then you get this crazy system where we get, a narcissist who can't, who might be able to do policies that 40% of the country wants, but can't make decent decisions on a day-to-day basis.
I'm curious, Patrick, since you brought this up, Eric, and maybe I should direct this to Eric, right? You've taken it for granted that this citizenship test, and let me be provocative, this literacy test for voting is actually sort of obvious. Like, microeconomics, like how hard can this be? Like quickly. What if that task, let's just flip it around. And I think this is an empirical question, right? So maybe it's up in the air. What if that's just too hard? What if that's even harder than the task we have to hand, such as, for example, a task like judging character? It's as if we're making things easier for people, but how difficult is that question? And why
what we should do is make the test. So I think there are degrees here. So we can, there's degrees of knowledge for which we can test. Make the test hard enough so that we get everything we want, unless we start to get a small enough electorate that they do start voting in their self-interest, because now their vote is actually powerful enough for them to act selfishly by voting. So
I'm sorry, just Eric, if I may interrupt there, I think I was misunderstood. Let me just clarify.
Okay.
Not if the test is hard, but if the task of constructing the test is hard, right? The test has to be written. And you've taken it for granted that it would be easy, for example, to summarize the basic economic knowledge that people need. But what if that task itself, which of course has to be decided in some way, what if that task is too hard? What if we can't plan well enough to get that right? And like I say, I think you've taken it for granted that it would be easy for you, for example, to write down just basic policy stuff. How hard can this be? Why should we think that's actually, since I've never seen the test, why should I think it's easy?
It might not be easy. It might be difficult. It might be achievable, but difficult. It sounds like you might be suggesting that it's going to be so onerous that it's like it's not practically feasible at all. I'm optimistic. I'm sanguine about that. I mean, I don't think it's, it might take some work to put it together. I don't know. That's all I can say, I guess.
I have a question that is a follow-up from something Simon was asking earlier in your exchange, where he said that, let me reconstruct how I understood it at any rate, that let's face it, 95% of the people who support epistocracy, who've read that book, are going to be Biden voters if they vote at all. And let's say what Simon said is true, and I think it is, that rich counties infallibly go for Biden. So did I understand you correctly, Simon? How about just make an easy test now that the rich people get to vote and poor people don't? Was that it?
Well, I guess I was I was trying to suggest that I think Eric would reject that idea for political reasons. So the question of whether he's made that distinction, right? Whether he's sort of taken a step back. But I think you're talking about something different. So let me continue, Patrick.
Okay. Oh, well, you'll need to clarify for me then. But Eric said no, I would reject that. And I just want to ask why. I mean, I took Simon's skeptical question to be quite powerful.
Yeah,
I think
Patrick, you're on the same wavelength back again, right? It's like, okay, we want to get this test right. And there have been proposals. Robin Hanson has a bet on values, vote on beliefs proposal that's much more economic, monetary in flavor. And so, this is a way to flip it around. If this is really an epistemic as opposed to political question, how do you know that letting the richest people vote is not going to is not the right way to make decisions?
So I had a problem with, I think my objection was the way that, I forgot actually what I was objecting to, but I wouldn't object to that kind of first order result. It's a consequence of the view. It might be the case that it turns out that who passes the test is the group that passes the test are members of certain other groups in society that such as the rich or something along those lines. If it's correct that people vote based on what they perceive to be the national self-interest, then that's not a problem. That's better, right? I mean, so Jason Brennan has a quote in his book that's like maybe a little bit tone deaf, but it's substantively correct. So he's talking about racial disparities, and he says something like, and I'm quoting Jason here. He says something like, maybe what what poor African Americans need in this country is to exclude the bottom 80% of white voters. So that's the general. So that's a direct quote from him. The thought behind that is that there's a benefit to people who have been historically marginalized, potentially, to just letting the chips fall where they may in terms of letting the most knowledgeable people vote. And then they'll enact programs to help marginalized communities not be as marginalized. And then at the end result might be that they actually are part of the epistocracy at the end. That's kind of his view. So I'm not sure what to think about that. That's kind of the general thought is where I would go in response.
It sounds to me so much like the framers' arguments for land qualifications. I mean, they didn't think that money and being rich was just good. They thought that if you were rich, you were more likely to be better educated, more likely to be better informed, more likely to make rational decisions, and so on. And so meritocracy or epistocracy and oligarchies line up really neatly. That was their argument. And since they thought, well, it's really impractical to come up with these tests, they didn't actually have that thought, but cut through it all and just say you can't vote unless you've got, at least 10 acres.
Yeah, but against that, that may have been somewhat true back then when it was almost guaranteed because nobody else had access to education. Now, however, we have a whole political bourgeoisie who are essentially unqualified, who are amongst the richest people in the world, right? Or, a lot of rich people who are essentially unqualified, who may be educated but are not intelligent. That's the thing. Education is not correlated to intelligence. And you've actually made this point to me, Dr. Miller. Just as qualifications do not correlate with, let's say, being moral.
Yeah.
That's why I think it depends in the end what the
So
test actually is asking.
I mean, I agree with that. In terms of excluding people, again, the burden is on someone to explain why it's bad to have people in a certain group be, to have an elite set of voters who are going to be better at voting. I mean, again, this just falls out of the argument for epistocracy that you're going to get some level of elitism, even if it's a significant portion of who currently votes. And the question is, what's the problem with that? If we're no, please.
I just want to make a maybe this is an overly subtle distinction, right? So you could say, all right, only Harvard grads because the Harvard education's great. Maybe the test is such that it's testing core competencies as you would see them. And it just turns out like, Harvard education's the only thing that really can help you crack the test. Now those Harvard graduates are rich. So there's a sort of accidental correlation. It happens that the wealthy are better at this. It could have turned out another way. So that's one kind of thing. We may disagree with that. But if we go back to this test question, what if the test itself is such that, for example, and I think this is maybe what Patrick's trying to get at, what if the test itself is essentially something along the lines of show me your bank account? Because for us, that's the best proof that you have the practical skills to interact with other people, to succeed in managing employees, all sorts of things. You could imagine some pretty good arguments for it. Perhaps at least as good as believing the whatever the economic consensus is. So for me, this comes back to this question of why would you reject that? Or let's say that was democratically voted upon. Let's say that was the decision that people made. Again, would you be comfortable with that? Or would you say, oh no, actually, even though that's a political decision, that's the wrong one, so we're gonna just cancel that, and sorry, I forget I ever mentioned epistocracy.
So it depends on whether we take that to be evidence that the technology has a bug or not. And I would, in order to argue that shows that the technology has a bug, then we need an argument for that. So I guess I would just ask for that missing step, because at the end of the day, this is, again, I'm assuming the thing that Patrick and I disagree about here, just for the sake of argument, just for the sake of responding to this objection, attacking epistocracy on its own terms, right? So, but my response is simply, I don't see what's necessarily wrong with the test of show me your bank account if you get the right result. If that's a great heuristic, then that's fantastic. That avoids all the other problems with constructing the test.
And I'll make this. I'll tell this little joke, and then I'll just make sure not to talk too much. There's a classic joke, right? Is it a bug or a feature, right? Yeah. And whether something is a bug or a feature is often judged by reference to the purpose of the machine or the purpose of the program, right? Obviously, there are some bugs that crash the program. That's obviously bad, but other things are a little mysterious, right? And the developer will say, no, like that looks, they'll get a bug report and say, no, that's the intended behavior. And in the end, the judge is how we use things. And I wonder if that, again, brings us to the question of judging if it's a bug is, again, a political decision, right? If it's not something that you can make an argument for solely on the basis of sort of knowledge claims as opposed to purpose claims?
Yeah, I need to think about that. Yeah, I mean, this goes back to the idea of, you know, whether you can judge the technology based on its construction and its functions, rather than its outputs. And yeah, I mean, that's, I think, something that you're right. It's something that an epistocrat needs to reckon with.
I don't know whether this was Simon's purpose, but it's how I would take up that question, which is this now calls into question the idea that politics is a technology. If in the end, the decision between whether something's a bug and a feature is a question of, well, what's the purpose? That's what we do in politics, is we ask, what are we doing here? What's the point? Why are we gathered to, what are we doing? What good is it that we're trying to achieve? There's no technology for determining that. Technology is, how do you get, what are the means to get the good?
One of the things that I keep thinking of in this discussion is just the standardized tests that we have now. So like the SAT, and using that as a metric of putting people into institutions of a higher education, right? And, you know, the SAT might not be it might not be the foolproof way of judging whether or not somebody's going to do well in higher education, or in this case, if it's a standardized test on who's able to vote, it might not necessarily bring in everybody who should be participating in the voting process. But of course, the people who do well on the SAT invariably do better than people who don't do well on the SAT in institutions of higher education. Now, there might be a fourth, I think, is the statistic of people who do poorly on the SAT actually are able to pass through institutions of higher education that still allow them in for whatever reasons. But if at the end of the day, the people who are getting in are, I guess, contributing to the system, voting, running the system in a way that benefits the majority of people, it shouldn't particularly matter if certain people are being excluded from the process, so long as at the end of the day, it's all running well.
Well, you just
You muted yourself.
Oh, at the end, so long as at the end of the day, it all just runs well.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, that's the thought behind epistocracy. You know, what do I care? You know, suppose I get a false negative result, I'm unjustly excluded from voting, I still get the benefit of the system, right? So, and, you know, yeah, there's going to be false negatives and false positives. I mean, there'll probably be false negatives on the driving test. You know, you might have been nervous that day or whatever, you were tired, you didn't get any sleep the night before, so you fail your driver's test. Really, you're like a fantastic driver, right? And okay, you can take the test again in 3 months or whatever. The same thing could be true of the voting exam.
Actually, a strength I see with what Dan just said is that this kind of epistocratic system, if you figure out a test or a metanormative set, is fairly self-selective. You don't actually have to enforce it. You do not actually have to, you know, it doesn't necessarily lead to an oligarchy. Whereas in a democracy is not self-selective. It has to enforce the equality of all. And as such, it necessarily creates that kind of union between the tyrants and the masses, which creates the kind of oligarchy we see right now, the kind of veiled oligarchy of, well, most governments, frankly.
Yeah, that makes me think of one additional thing that kind of additional form of epistocracy that's possible, where you have you have what's called an epistocratic veto of legislation, where you have something analogous to a court, but the basis for the court is not constitutional law or something along those lines. It's just what's the best policy, and you have a large group, perhaps of a packed epistocratic court that can veto. It can't pass legislation, but can veto any legislation that is bad, because the idea is it's more harmful to have bad legislation than it is to fail to pass good legislation or something along those
I'm just so thoroughly confused about these notions of good legislation, bad legislation. The test is good if things go well. The use and so on. These are all normative notions that's what politics is about, and yet this is presuming that there's going to be agreement about them.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, you have to settle this issue somehow. Maybe the epistocratic court is they all have, you know, degrees in moral philosophy, or maybe it's voted on by the entire populace about what the goals are, and the epistocratic court is just designed to effectively police the means by which those goals are achieved through policy. I don't know. These are good questions. I don't have any straightforward answers to them. I don't think Jason Brennan has any straightforward answers to them either, by the way.
I don't imagine.
Well, I think one of the benefits that are brought up by the founders in the Federalist Papers is that at least under this system where you're appointing representatives to enact the legislation, you have, or at least whenever it's not so heavily democratic, you have people to hold accountable for when things do go wrong. So if we're worried about enacting legislature where things don't, or where things go too far, at least you have people to hold accountable. You know who those individuals are who are governing you, who are, I guess, just in terms of the legislature enacting the laws, you know who those people are. Whereas in a more democratic society, and it's more divorced, and so you don't quite know who to hold responsible for the problems, and especially the more bureaucratic and the bigger the government gets, it's the same.
Or how to hold them responsible. I mean, as you know, the epistocratic electorate is supposed to have a much more narrower set of criteria by which it judges laws, as opposed to the, you know, all these crazy biases that the, you know, the non-elite use to. So I mean, taking account of the way that laws are passed, or the ways in which the ways in which people, our representatives are elected, you know, has to deal with all the, you know, human psychology and emotion in ways that in a more epistocratic, with a more epistocratic elector, you just get down to brass tacks and talk about rational stuff, right? That's the idea. By the way, I'm surprised no one asked about autocracy at all. I think I'm more inclined towards endorsing autocracy than I am epistocracy. By the way, Alex Guerrero's work is more rigorous than Jason Brennan's from what I've seen. Maybe that's why I'm more convinced by it. But he's really good. You should check out his he has a forthcoming book that's supposed to come out in 2021, Defending Autocracy, in a book length manuscript. But he has a piece in Aeon magazine, which is online, and a couple of papers in philosophy journals defending autocracy.
Autocracy seemed to me just beyond the pale. So, I mean, have you ever been to jury selection, which is a kind of lottery system?
Nobody have. After I told them that my dad is a criminal defense attorney, they kicked me off that jury right quick.
Yeah, so everybody who has a life at all gets an excuse, and what you end up with are the people, just the worst people.
Yeah,
you can imagine.
the old adage about 12 people too stupid to get out of jury duty. I mean, yeah.
So the autocracy is that, but now for really important stuff, not just criminal decisions.
There's something to that, Patrick.
With the additional fact that random people are going to be put through a year-long education in like high-level economics or medical theory or whatever, that, I mean, it's hard enough to get people who come to college to learn about these things, but the thought that a random person off the street is going to go through advanced degrees in those things.
Yeah, I mean, the alternative though is a corrupt jury, right? You got to compare it to what we've got now.
Yeah.
If we have 12 people on a jury who are being bought off by one, I mean, go watch the movie Runaway Jury with Dustin Hoffman and Gene Hackman. It's great. This is exactly what happens. I mean, it's But that's the analogy. It's
Yeah.
you know.
If I may just put in a little empirical point, one of my colleagues he's British. He was in Britain serving on a jury. His experience was that it was extraordinarily good. People took it extraordinarily seriously. It was a diverse group. They deliberated very, very carefully. He was very impressed by it. So, maybe we could sort of say this is obviously wrong. I'm not sure it's so obviously wrong, actually, that it maybe discounts some of the seriousness with which, quote unquote, the ordinary person, the one we're sort of trying to understand, how seriously the ordinary person takes their political lives. So I'm not quite sure it's so obviously nuts.
Yeah. It just seems to me a terrible infringement of personal liberty too. The fact that I could just get a call and now all of a sudden for a year, I've got to study hard subject I don't care about. And then for another year, I have to make decisions about it when
Sorry,
I've got kids or whatever.
I wasn't clear about this. The proposal is that it's optional.
Oh.
Yeah. So it's not like jury duty in that sense.
Okay.
But you would get paid. So like Guerrero suggests paying someone like 120% of their normal salary with a floor of $100,000 a year or something like that. So it's supposed to be highly incentivized to do this.
Mm-hmm.
My first perception too was, one, how do you choose the people who are going to be doing the educating and facilitating that? And then two, I guess, why wouldn't you just have those individuals who have already been deemed qualified enough do the governing in the first place on those particular topics? And I guess you could incentivize it by saying, yeah, it has to be a year-long process where there's a lot of fact gathering, because otherwise the jury would just immediately concede to whatever the experts say, because they don't know. Why would they engage in so long education just for them to understand it whenever they've got people right there who already do? But then it just seems to run into the problem of, you've got to wait a year to make these policy changes. It doesn't seem feasible to me to run a government like that, where it's so intense in terms of how much. I mean, it already feels like there's too much stuff that has to go into passing a law right now, let alone there has to be a year-long process of education of a group of people before that decision can be made. So it would seem to me like you should just figure out who those people are who are competent enough to make those decisions and put them in charge of it to begin with, instead of bothering to even educate a group of jurors.
Those are all really good points. Dan, I just want to say, has anyone seen Yes, Minister? Because that's basically what that show is the civil servants know everything, and then they get a guy for 1 year whom they have to educate, and they basically manipulate him into doing what they want anyway. It's the ultimate deep state theory.
Yeah, I mean that's like a very extreme version of epistocracy, where you just government by the professors, professocracy. On a selfish level, I'm inclined to endorse that view, but I mean, look, Dan, your point is a really good one. I'm going to have to think about that one.
Well, should we wrap it up?
I think so.
We've been going on for an hour and 40 minutes.
Yeah, the discussions with the small groups are always better than the big groups. Maybe that's an argument for epistocracy.
So thanks everyone. This was a really good discussion. Actually, I learned quite a bit from all of you, so thanks.